Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and in today's video we are going to have a look at the difference between the CFM56 and the IAE V2500 engine. So before we start, I did already do a video on the topic prior to the release of the Fenix, but I do feel there is such a great difference. Fenix have done such a great model of the V2500 engine that I only feel it to be fair to actually redo the video, not with the freeware of the Horizon Sim, but actually with the actual Fenix Airbus. It does deserve that justice, if we're completely honest here. Alright, so let's start with the general differences. So the CFM56 is the more widespread engine, but the IAE V2500 actually is the engine that conserves a little bit more fuel. The fuel usage of the IAE engine is approximately 3% less than that of the CFM. It also uses a little bit less oil. On the downsides though, it is louder, it takes longer to start up, and it is not as responsive as the CFM56 engine is. So there are those upsides in terms of fuel and oil usage, but there are certainly downsides there as well. Now, let's go ahead and have a look into a couple of the differences that matter more towards the pilots. So, Fenix did deliver the Select 1 version of the V2500 engine, and while that does not really show in the FMS or anything the likes, if we go on to the aircraft status page, we just see V2527-A5. A5 is the Airbus version of the engine. Then we are not going to see that Select 1 modification. Basically what the Select 1 does is to slightly reduce fuel emissions a little bit more. Now, what's getting more important though for the pilots is the way how the engine is driven, and over here obviously we do have the largest difference right in the indication on our engine warning display. And on here, as you can see, we've got an additional gauge, which is the EPR gauge. Now, EPR means engine pressure ratio, and basically is the ratio from the turbine outlet pressure to the compressor inlet pressure. What that means is that basically you at all times get a direct indication of the thrust that the engine actually produces. Remember, pressure on the back divided by pressure on the inlet means thrust, because that pressure is now propulsing the airplane forward. So that much for basic theory about what EPR is. Now, when an engine manufacturer lays down the foundations for their new engine, they basically decide whether they want to drive the engine on EPR or N1, where N1 basically is the speed of the low pressure turbines section of the engine, so basically of the fan that you got in the front of the engine. So advantages of EPR is that you always get a direct indication of your thrust. Advantage of N1 is that it is a simpler system and not as prone to error. However, talking about common errors with both of the systems, for EPR we got the problem that we have two probes in our engine, one in the front in the compressor inlet section and one in the aft in the turbine outlet section, and if any of those probes fails or, for example, ices up, like has happened in the Potomac River accident where a 737-200 departed with an EPR probe frozen up and therefore with much too little thrust, and therefore stalled shortly after becoming airborne after an already very long takeoff run. N1 also has its limitations. Now, N1 basically is the speed at which the fan rotates, and that speed has one big disadvantage. As the condition of the engine deteriorates over its lifespan, we can say that any given rotational speed is going to result in slowly but steadily producing less thrust over the lifespan of the engine. And that in turn means that the engine is weakening without actually indicating it to the pilots. Not so much when you're using EPR, since EPR is always going to show you the actual thrust conditions of the engines immediately at the engine, which in turn means that any weakening over time of the engine is going to be deducted out, and the N1 is going to be adjusted by the FADEC in order to achieve the same constant EPR. Now, a downside of EPR, however, is that it is not very accurate when you're trying to do small control inputs, and that it is generally rather hard for the pilot to actually remember all those EPR values compared to the N1 values, especially since EPR is influenced by pressure and pressure changes when you accelerate or decelerate the airplane. Now, the electronic engine controls of the aircraft, the FADEC, is going to calculate all these things out, but you can see that there is quite a bit of technical stuff going on in the background of an EPR indication, and therefore it is a little bit more prone to error than an N1 indication. So take it as that. EPR is the more quality instrument, while N1 is the more sturdy instrument. Now, one thing that is well worth noting is that when you are doing very small changes in thrust, you might just see barely any input on the EPR gauge, while there might be a large reaction on the N1 gauge. For this, you need to understand that N1 is not a linear indication. Right now we see an indication of approximately 22% N1 over here, but that is not proportional to 22% thrust. So generally in the lower N1 ranges, thrust is only increased very slowly, while at the higher N1 ranges, thrust can easily increase much more. To give you an example, if we just take this current engine configuration here, now I'm adding just a little bit of thrust there. So now I've added just 4% N1. You can see there is basically no reaction at all on the EPR gauge, while there is quite a reaction on the N1 gauge, especially in the regions of taxi thrust, so up to 40% N1. You can see that on the EPR gauge we basically get almost no reaction at all, so just a very, very small reaction, while on the N1 gauge you do get quite a strong reaction already. So this leads us to the point of controlling the engines, but this is something that we will talk about a little bit later. What we're going to talk about now is engine start. So you might have asked yourself, why is this idiot sitting here only having one engine running and not the other? Well, the reason is that I do want to demonstrate engine start, because the IAE engine does something that we haven't seen on our CFM-driven engine, and that we haven't seen on many flight simulator add-ons at all yet. And that is a dry motoring sequence of the engine prior to the engine start. Now, when the IAE engine was first implemented on Airbus aircraft, they included a 50-second dry motoring period during the engine start. This has later on been reduced to a 30-second period, and this is what's in the airplane right now. However, be aware that there are still some dynamic indications involved in this. Let's go ahead and conduct an engine start, and then we're going to talk about it while the engine starts. So we are already running on APU bleed, as you can see, so let's go ahead and start engine 1. Engine start, selector, ignition start, well till the FADEC is powered. Alright, and engine 1 start. I'm gonna start the timer up here so that we can watch it. What is going to happen is the N2 is going to run up to just shy of 25% approximately. It's not going to go to maximum motoring N2, but it is going to go something a little bit lower. And then the engine is going to automatically start motoring. And only after the FADEC has reached some predetermined values, that is when the engine is actually going to inject fuel and then continue the startup process. You can see this now. We've reached our motoring N2, which is approximately 25% N2 roundabout, and now the engine is just motoring. The reason it is doing this is because of the heat that's inside the engines. So imagine the following. You've got an engine that is running at rather high temperatures. The temperature in the combustion chamber can easily reach 1000 degrees centigrade while the engine runs. So when the engine is shut down, there will be a lot of residual heat, as you can see on the EGT indication over here. It's currently 280 degrees centigrade inside our engine. Now, in order to understand what's happening here, we need to visualize that heat is always moving up. So the upper part of the engine is going to be hotter than the lower part of the engine. Now this means that the upper part of the movable components of the engine, say for example the fan blades, the turbine blades, the compressor blades and so on, are going to be at a different temperature than those at the bottom when the engine was parked. For this reason the plane is now motoring the engine in order to spread the thermal conditions a little bit and bring them to a similar state before injecting fuel and actually starting up. Now this process is going to depend very much on how cold or how hot the engine was when the start process was initiated. For example, you can see that we're at 2 minutes right now and it's just starting to inject fuel now. So obviously I loaded the plane with the engines running on the runway and then just shut an engine down. That means the engine was shut down for maybe 5 minutes only before the start process was initiated. So for this reason it conducted a pretty long motoring sequence. Now when you start the engine up from cold conditions, so you're loading the airplane at the gate, it's been parked overnight, obviously things are going to go much quicker. Alright, so that was the sound of the generator. Here's the engine avail indication, so with that we have completed our engine start. Now let's go ahead and just note the time here, which is almost 3 minutes, so that's been quite a lengthy engine start, but that is completely normal for the IAE engines. Alright, so then we can go ahead and do our procedures and prepare our airplane for departure. Now let's have a look into how to fly the IAE engines. As I mentioned earlier already, the difference between EPR and N1 can be quite significant, and in many times we need to make small adjustments in order to control our airplane properly. Making those small adjustments, however, can be rather difficult on the EPR gauge and is much easier done through the N1 gauge. And indeed, if you go into the quick reference handbook of the airplane, you will notice that, for example, thrust values for severe turbulence penetration are given in N1 and not in EPR. So basically the primary flying reference still remains the N1 gauge, even though you now control the engine through the EPR gauge. However, in case you're interested, if there is a failure with the EPR gauges, then you do have the N1 mode switches up here on the engine panel. So if we just turn one of those on, then we should now get an N1 indication which we can control. Okay, we'll try that again in flight. Maybe it's just on the ground that it behaves different than what I'm expecting over here. Okay, so with that we are pretty much done with the theory of how the engine works and with the theory of how the engine is operated. Let's go ahead and have a quick practical example here by flying a traffic pattern. So a brake is released. We're going to start with setting your thrust on takeoff. First of all, the EPR driven engines tend to run at a rather high idle thrust. Now this is obviously dependent per engine and might be completely different, say for example on a Rolls-Royce engine, than it is on the V2500 that we've got over here. What is worth mentioning, however, is that the airplane might easily taxi on idle thrust. The Select 1 variation of the engine that we got installed here already has a slightly reduced idle thrust compared to the standard version, but nonetheless, when the brakes are released and you're standing on a typical not sloping condition, so over here we can see over here on the runway that we got a slight upslope right now. On that upslope the plane is not moving forward, but when you're standing on an even ground, the plane might very well taxi an idle thrust. But more on that in a different video. So what we are caring about right now is thrust setting. So we're going to start stabilizing the engine at 1.05 EPR, and you will notice that that equates to approximately 50% N1, so you might as well just remember it at 50% N1. So I'm in the brakes right now, and we're going to go ahead and set a bit of thrust. So in order to stabilize the engine, move the thrust levers approximately here, 1.05, And you can see very slow, small reaction there on the EPR gauge, but on the N1 gauge you can actually see how the engine ran up quite a bit further. Alright, so let's go ahead and set our takeoff thrust now and see how that is going to look like. Right, takeoff thrust set. And indications normal. Right, I'm going to release the brakes now. Let's have a look at how this is going to fly. In general, it is worth pointing out that your visual picture of the engine warning display might look a bit different from what you're used to, in that you've got engines which are actually pointing to something to the left of the 12 o'clock position, like here on the EPR indication. That's completely normal, nothing to worry about. Alright, V1 rotate. Positive climb gear up. Nav, checked. And here we go. Alright, so I'm going to continue straight ahead for a short moment, then we'll make a left-hand turn and come back for a nice visual approach on the runway 8 right. So, let's go ahead and monitor how the engine is going to work now. Flight director's coming off, bird on. So, we'll start accelerate and we'll pull the engine back into climb thrust. Auto thrust is coming off. So far, completely normal operation. Now things are going to get more interesting once we're actually going to level off in 3000 up here, and once we're going to start using manual thrust. So flap 0. Let's maintain the green dot speed over here, 1000 feet a minute rate of climb, and now we can start reducing our power. What you will notice is that the engine is still pretty quick to react. This is something that just is a general flight sim issue. So if you remember that I told you earlier that the V2500 engine takes a little bit longer to react, then this is always in the context of general flight simulation engines. You will notice that not only have the new engines been added, but the CFM engines have also been updated by Fenix, and this is something that you are absolutely recommended to try out. The engines should behave quite different now compared to what they used to do earlier. Alright, so leveling off. General rule of thumb here is that you can take the pitch and power values of the CFM 56 engine and simply subtract 5% N1, and that is going to give you normally a rather good IAE reading for your N1. Again, you do notice that I'm saying that flying it on N1 over here and not on EPR, because let's be honest, you don't want to remember all those values. Especially you will see now that we are just about in the range of thrust where we want to maintain our green dot speed. If you compare the amount of EPR input with the amount of N1 input, you will notice that now that I'm increasing thrust just slightly, there is hardly any visible EPR input, while there is quite some visible N1 input. So, as I mentioned, try to remember your pitch and power values based on N1 rather than based on EPR, because it is really going to make your life much, much easier. Alright, a couple of general words here. Regardless of the engine type installed, it is really worth pointing out that Fenix have done a great job with this update. The airplane now behaves much, much nicer in terms of controllability of the speed and controllability of the engines, which by the way is really how a real-world jet engine works. When you're operating in those thrust ranges like we are right now, where you basically try to maintain a decent speed, and I'm not talking about 300 knots, neither am I talking about 100 knots, but when you're trying to maintain a normal speed range like we are right now, you do your input on the engines, and basically your speed is going to react more or less immediately, and like that it is possible to steer the airplane very, very nicely, and Fenix have done an awesome job on that. Now, coming over to our next interesting question, let's just go for N1 mode once again, see what that's going to look like. So it is a guarded switch, as you can see. So engine 1, N1 mode. Well, this is interesting. We should still get an N1 indication, and what should happen is the blue circle over here, the one controlling the thrust, should move down to the N1 gauge, while the EPR gauge goes blank like it does over here. But the N1 gauge absolutely shouldn't. Remember, we're in N1 mode, so obviously this should still be working. Okay, little problem there that we just found, too bad. But in general, the circle is going to go down here, and provided that the A320 works similar to the A330, your auto thrust is no longer going to be available, because auto thrust is only going to work based on EPR on the IAE engines and not based on N1. So that's the one thing that you do need to know over there. Alright, so we are flying on the downwind. We are going to start our approach in a couple of moments. Let's just go for the most important data down here. QNH is 3015. The rest of it I'll simply leave blank. I'm going to make it a config 3 landing. Yes, thank you. Alright, and that's it. So, the important point here when you are going to fly your approach is how do you set your thrust? Well, again, you are going to use N1 as your primary reference. You're looking for between 50 and 55% N1, depending on the weight, the flap setting, etc. And most importantly, you just look down at the N1 gauge. Now, what is important as well, however, is to realize how engine thrust should be set. And I feel the need to emphasize this once again, because it is something that is easily forgotten amongst flight simmers. So, the basic strategy for setting your thrust is to keep the engine thrust as constant as possible. You can see that in level flight here, I'm barely touching my controls at all. Rather, what I'm doing is I'm setting my target thrust, then I'm just waiting to see what happens with the speed. As you can see, we can maintain the speed pretty perfectly over here. Now, I want you to do the very same thing on your approach and on the final, in that you don't excessively move your thrust levers up, down, up, down, up, down, like many flight simmers do, but instead I want you to go to idle thrust when you want to reduce your speed significantly, pull off about 5% N1 when you want to reduce your speed just slightly, and most importantly, keep a constant power set, even if your speed varies just slightly. If you see a constant trend of the speed going up or down, obviously you do need to provide correction, but in general, that is not really required too much when flying a jet engine, and that is the trick behind maintaining proper power management on an approach with a jet aeroplane. Alright, so final approach course 092, let's go ahead and select that so that we're all set up for the approach, and we're going to use an auto brake here as well. Alright, so as you can see, in general, my engines are still pretty much exactly where I set them. I haven't even touched the thrust lever yet, and indeed I haven't touched any controls on this so far. Okay, we're about to turn base. Let's go ahead, extend our flaps, and then start our base turn. It's also really nice to notice there is I've only done an aileron input here, not an elevator input. Look at how nicely the Airbus does this. You just need a very tiny input here and correcting. And look at how I haven't even touched my thrust, but I've simply extended the slats, speed comes back a little bit, and we are now on the base turn. Right, so tiny bit more thrust now that I see constant trend vector. But as you can see, I've just added a little bit of thrust without doing too many further corrections. And just adding that tiny bit of thrust arrested my deceleration, and now I'm just keeping it there. So approximately 5% is a very good value to adjust for when you are doing slight thrust changes. Just set it, see what's gonna happen. Okay, so we can now initiate our descent, so let's pull off a little bit of power. And down we go. Again, the trick behind flying a jet aeroplane is small and deliberate changes everywhere, and most importantly, do your changes based upon the pitch and the power rather than based on the reading of your instruments. With that I mean, yeah, thank you, silence. Okay, so with that I mean that when I want to initiate the descent, I'm looking at the ADI. I'm simply putting in 1 or 2 degrees pitch less, that initiates the descent. If I want to change my power, 1 or 2% less power, say 5% to be conservative, works perfectly. Okay, need to adjust a little bit to the right here. Looks like that runway track wasn't entirely correct. Let's set the track buck over here and off we go. And likewise, let's just change that color of that altitude box. Here we go. Nothing amber, everything good. Alright, so now we're going to configure the airplane for the landing. As you can see, passing 2,000 feet roundabout, we're going to go flaps 2. And as the French say, the aircraft does not balloon. Not at all, no. I needed a deliberate forward stick input here. So we're at flaps 2, landing gear down. And this is really when the drag is going to come in and when the airplane is going to get slow. In the meantime, we can leave the engine in idle at all times. That applies for both the CFM and the IAE engines. And we basically only need the thrust as soon as we are stabilized a little bit lower. Okay, flaps 3. And here we go, that's the drag coming in. Okay, so overall, as soon as we are reaching our target speed, I am going to increase my thrust to approximately 50% N1. And then I will initially just leave it there and see how that's going to work. So, passing 1,000, we are fully configured. Passing 500, we gotta be fully established. And obviously including the correct thrust setting, but we're working towards that. So we're approaching our target speed, the trend vector hits the target. Now what I'm doing is just to increase my power a little bit and see where the engines are going. If they go towards 50% N1 like they do right now, perfect. And as you can see, we've got a slight trend to accelerate, so let's use a little bit less, 45 maybe. So we're changing the thrust in terms of single percentages here. As you can see, 45 working pretty well with the flap 3 landing configuration. And now, I'm just keeping my thrust there, not doing any changes to it anymore, and now we can land our plane off that. Speed is a tiny bit high, so we might just pull off another 2 or 3% here in order to get the speed to come down a little bit again. And that's really all we need. As you can see, works very, very well. Fenix have done a great job on that.
50, 40, 30, 20, retard, 5.
Idle, flare, put it down. Here we are. Nice. Alright, so spoilers, reverse green decel. So as you can see, very, very nice and controllable, and the most important thing here, the engines react in the way how I'm expecting them to react. So the new engine model is really working very nicely. Also, a couple of tips in this one as to how to handle your thrust in order to keep your airplane nicely under control and how real pilots would do it, which I surely hope are going to make your flying a little bit better. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. Hope that you found this one interesting. If you did, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I would like to say thank you very much for watching, and if you like the video, be sure to leave a like in YouTube as well, as it does really help out the channel. Now, comment to let me know what you think of it, let me know your experience with the new engines, and finally, if you're up for more, don't forget to subscribe. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching, everyone. If you really love my content, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. But until then, I'd like to say thank you very much, and see you all again on the next one.